everyone, and welcome to Pod TV's Economic Talk Show with the Honorable David M. Walker, who is the former Comptroller General of the United States. And joining us today will also be a group of subject matter experts and a global panelist discussing the economic current affairs and how it is impacting the United States and the rest of the world. My name is Kimberly Calhoun. I am replacing Nick Palaveda for the next 3 weeks while he's traveling the globe. So we are filming live. If you happen to have any suggestions or questions, please feel free to text us today. We look forward to hearing from you. Meanwhile, join me in welcoming the Honorable David M. Walker.
Hello, Kim. How are you?
Hello, David. I never work well without Nick. You know, having that great team to work with is just always nice. You know what I mean?
Oh, I understand. We kind of get accustomed to doing things a certain way, and makes it a lot more comfortable. Do we have other people going to join us this morning?
I hope so. I sent out a notice last night, so we're just waiting for the panelists.
Okay, well, that's fine. And my understanding is one of the things that we really want to talk about this week is the banking system and what's been going on with regard to the banking system in the United States and frankly other places around the world as well, especially Switzerland. But we probably could start with the United States. I apologize for my voice in advance because I'm trying to get over a cold, and so I'm not my normal self, but I'll make it, I'm sure. All right. So do you want to start with the banking system? How do you want to do it?
Yeah, let's talk about the banking failures. And you know, I took a gander at going out and doing a little research, and there were a lot of bank failures since 2020. I went and looked at the FDIC's list, and they had a long list of bank failures. And maybe we can discuss a little bit about what's causing this, and maybe some potential ways to correct the problem if there are any.
Well, let's talk about the two most notable ones in the United States first, and they're all within the last week or so. And that is the Silicon Valley Bank out in California and the Standard Bank in New York. And, you know, we've talked on this program about a number of economic issues, including recently we've talked about, you know, the deteriorating financial condition and fiscal outlook of the U.S. and the rise in inflation and what are some of the factors that contributed to that. Let me posit that I think there is a lot of interconnectivity going on, including with regard to these recent banking failures that have been publicized so greatly. First, the federal government spent way too much money over the last 2+ years, trillions of dollars more than normally would be the case, much of which was due to COVID, a lot of which, quite frankly, was wasted. But if you combine excess federal spending with loose monetary policy, meaning a dramatic expansion in the money supply, what you get is excess inflation. When you get excess inflation, the Federal Reserve's primary mission is to maintain stable prices. It's got two other missions, but that's the primary mission. And so therefore, in the face of excess inflation, it had to raise interest rates. And it had a dramatic increase in interest rates over the last year. The increase in interest rates results in a reduction in the current value of fixed income securities. Many banks were encouraged by the Federal Reserve to buy treasuries. Some bought longer term treasuries, and the longer the term, the more adverse impact there is on the value of your investment in the face of rising interest rates. Then some banks, for a variety of reasons, experienced extraordinary withdrawal requests from their depositors. So when you combine the fact that they're being asked to be able to provide a lot more cash than normal with the fact that their investments, many had gone down significantly in value because of rising interest rates and the reduction in their fixed income portfolio, that caused a liquidity crisis. And that's what ended up happening in Silicon Valley Bank and to a certain extent, Standard Bank, although we still don't have all the facts. And let me go back to something that we've debated before, and that is the so-called modern monetary theory, which I think is the culprit of a lot of this. The theory that says that deficits and debt don't matter as long as you can borrow in your own reserve currency unless and until you have excess inflation. Well, that was an empowering factor for the Congress when, which caused them to spend a lot more money. And as I just said, more spending, loose monetary policy results in excess inflation, results in higher interest rates, results in lower value in bond portfolios. And that combined with additional withdrawal requests can lead to liquidity crisis. And that's where we are. We have other issues. We have poor supervision. There's no question that there was inadequate supervision with regard to these banks, and we are going to need to change the regulatory requirements. Now, one of the things that, frankly, I'm concerned about, and there's been a total lack of transparency on, is, the president was quick to come out. The Treasury Secretary made comments, and others have made comments about, don't worry, everybody's going to get their money, and the taxpayers aren't going to pay a dime of this. Well, okay, the old story when politicians' lips will touch out. Okay, so, but there has been a total lack of transparency. There's certain things that I know for sure, and there's a lot that we don't know in order to be able to fully analyze it. Number one, the president has no unilateral authority, nor does the Treasury Secretary, nor does anyone, for that matter, any single person, have the unilateral authority to raise the insurance guarantee levels under the FDIC. And those insurance levels are $250,000 per account, but there are different kinds of accounts. So you could end up having more than that if it's a joint account or if you have different kinds of accounts. But the bottom line is there's no way that the president or any single individual can say, we're just going to waive the FDIC insurance limits. You're going to get all your money. And if that were to happen, then what would end up happening is that the banks would end up being charged a lot higher rates by the FDIC, which would be passed on to consumers, in various forms with fees and interest rates and things like that. There's no free lunch here. These politicians want to tell you there's a free lunch. There's not a free lunch, never have been, never will be a free lunch. So what I'm trying to figure out is, and again, total lack of transparency, where's the money coming from? Is it going to be additional capital infusions? Are there going to be loans that are going to be given so that they deal with the liquidity problem without having to affect the level of guarantees? We just don't know. And the other thing that's pretty clear is there's going to have to be reform to be able to differentiate between the level of guarantees that apply to individuals and the level of guarantees that apply to corporations and other businesses, because obviously most individuals don't have, more than $250,000 in each single bank.
Right.
Whereas many corporations and businesses do, if for nothing else, is for their payroll, right? They got to make payroll every week. Although I will tell you that more and more corporations are starting to diversify their cash holdings among multiple institutions as a risk mitigation strategy. And I think you'll see more of that. But, I see Dan's on. Maybe we can get Dan.
Yeah, why don't we get Dan in? And you can take a tea break for a second.
I'm gonna get some water, and I'll be right back.
Why don't you do that? Hello, Dan, and welcome to Economic Talk Show. You are one of the subject matter experts and global panelists, and today we're talking about the bank failures and how they existed. And David gave us a great rundown of some of the things, but the main issue is a lack of transparency.
Right.
And then we were talking about, how are they going to correct this problem, but also how does any suggestion impact us? And what are some of your ideas on that, Dan?
Well, just look at some of the shareholders, the majority of shareholders and depositors that were with that bank. And it gives you an idea of the economic and political agenda that they pursued, and they openly pursued a very woke agenda, and they were very, very irresponsible with the kinds of loans that they would give, because they gave it's basically new business startups. Majority of those fail, and they were overinvested in U.S. treasuries, and when the interest rates went up, the value of the treasuries went down, and the bottom fell out. That I still don't understand why the United States government is protecting this bank, other than a political agenda and the people that are part of it. It doesn't make sense for them to guarantee all of those depositors. They knew they're taking a risk, and they were in high concentrations in that bank. They could have been in any bank. They could have had their deposits diversified. They chose to do what they did, and so they deserve what they were supposed to get. And instead, the U.S. People are bailing them out. Americans are bailing them out. The smaller banks are bailing them out. Go ahead.
Dan, thanks very much. I appreciate you jumping in, because I'm trying to get over a cold. Here's what I'm concerned about, Dan. We don't know enough about who's doing what for whom and who's going to bear the cost. What I do know, as I mentioned before you came on, is neither the president nor the Treasury Secretary nor the head of the FDIC nor the Fed, no single individual has the unilateral authority to increase, much less eliminate, FDIC insurance limits.
I agree.
And so I don't know what they're doing. I mean, that tells me that they're somehow going to have an infusion of capital, all right, whether it be equity or whether it be loans or something of that nature, in order to deal with the short-term liquidity crisis, because they don't have the ability to eliminate the limit on FDIC guarantees. That would set a terrible precedent, and it's something that should not be allowed. At the same point, we also know that there have been attempts in the past to be able to do things unilaterally, which are likely to be struck down by the Supreme Court. And the latest example is student loan relief. No, the president doesn't have that authority. It's now before the Supreme Court. We'll see what ends up happening. But we're seeing by this president and many other ones try to use executive authority to an unprecedented amount without recognizing that the Congress has the power of the purse, and the Congress is the party under the Constitution, under Article 1 of the Constitution, that has to play a key role with regard to these decisions. You mentioned some interesting things. One, it's my understanding that one or both of these institutions didn't have a chief risk officer for the last several months. In addition to that, the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank was on the San Francisco Fed's board, which obviously leads you to say, what's going on here? How could they not know what's going on? In addition, it's my understanding that Barney Frank, yes, from Dodd-Frank, was on the board of Standard Bank in New York. And the last thing I'll say on this is, and you also mentioned the political dimension. These are just now coming out. The fact that the governor of California had business interests that had a lot of money in this bank. The fact that there are other key players that have a lot of money in the other New York bank. I don't see how you can say that, especially Standard Bank, I don't see how you could say that represented a systemic risk and still have a straight face. There were unique circumstances with regard to the Silicon Valley Bank, because they were financing disproportionately, and in some cases possibly imprudently, a lot of startups, right? Which are higher risk investments. In addition, there were a lot of tech companies, major tech companies, that use Silicon Valley Bank as their primary bank. And so there was probably more concentration risk as it relates to startups and tech companies, which we'll need to know more about. But the bottom line is, as I came back to at the beginning, too much spending, too much loose monetary policy, leads to excess inflation, leads to higher interest rates, leads to losses in fixed income securities, including treasuries. The longer the duration, the more the loss, combined with excess withdrawal requests, leads to a liquidity crisis, and that's where we are.
Yeah, and I think it's all deliberate policy.
Well, it's hard to believe that somebody would want to cause this. Yeah.
Well, it's happened.
Yeah.
And it's
Well,
stupid,
I know
and it's
happened.
foreseeable.
It's hard to believe.
It's foreseeable.
It's hard to
right?
believe that somebody would want. Well, 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 2 is 4, etc. I agree, but I don't think that anybody would want this outcome. I don't think anybody would wish for this outcome. Is my point.
No, and
Yeah.
but I want to add that something interesting that I read, and again could be rumors, but I read that they gave a notice to the people of, we're having issues and we're going to do X, Y, Z, and then all of a sudden the bank run hit rather than people being patient and willing to work through the situation. And could that bank run have been intentional to cause this to happen? I mean, could certain people have just said, you know what, we're just going to do this anyway, rather than sit patiently and wait?
We just don't know. I do know that we've got Shaquille, who I think is.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Shaq in and Mark. They're both in. Shaq from Down Under, one of our globalists, and Mark
down there.
I wouldn't call him a globalist.
He's not in Australia today.
No. But thank God for his
So
shirt. We never see him.
So I'm in the Maldives. I'm doing my best with these lights because where I was, which was a bit more nicely lit up, they've got the DJ going. So bear with me. I just want to make a couple of comments if I can. Firstly, Dave, I only came to save you because you have a cold. So everyone knows that I talk over you a lot. So I thought I'd come and save the day with your voice. But a couple of things I just want to say. Firstly, in 2008, the conversation was about banks being too big to fail, and we all know how I feel about politicians and the grand plans that they come up with. So the grand plan, as best as I can see it, was these banks are too big to fail. So what we're going to do is we're going to bail them out. We're going to have the TARP program to take over the bad assets. And what we're going to do is we're going to make them bigger. So we saw, Bank of America and Merrill Lynch merge. We saw Chase merge with JP Morgan, and we made the banks bigger. Now, why not make the banks smaller?
I agree.
Why not have, like you used to have, 30,000 banks or something you had before the Fed intervened, 150 years ago? Why not have a whole heap of small banks? Because surely if a small bank fails, you could actually bail out their depositors and let the bank fail, and you get more competition, you get creative destruction, things that the US were actually founded on. Those were the principles they were founded on. And secondly, you made the comment, you can't imagine this would be the outcome that they wanted. I just listen to what they say. The Australian Reserve said this as well, and we talked about this last year. The plan was, how do we bring down inflation? You either increase supply, which is a lot more complicated, but you either increase supply or you crush demand. And the Federal Reserve of the United States and the Reserve Bank of Australia and many other central banks around the world said the plan is we're going to crush demand. How do you crush demand? You drive up interest rates, you drive up the unemployment rate, and you sit back and you watch these banks fall. And frankly, the fact that the most of these depositors in this Silicon Bank are high net worth, sophisticated or accredited investors. They knew the risks that they were taking, and they've had 100%. In fact, they've had a higher level of bailout than what the FDIC insurance level was. Now, is that going to be the plan moving forward? Janet Yellen is reluctant to say that that's a plan moving forward. But the reality is you've driven up interest rates. Banks, because of laws and regulations, often have to invest in bonds. And we know that right now on the books, they're currently looking at $600 billion in losses. But what about all their off-balance sheet transactions? What about all their off-balance sheet swap arrangements? So, is the taxpayer going to cover all of it? If they're not going to cover all of it, why does this bank get special treatment? If they are going to cover all of it, then when you make the comment that one of these banks didn't have a risk officer, why should they? You don't need a risk officer because you don't have any risk. The risk is borne by the taxpayer. This is just politicians, I think, letting down the everyday person in our countries and making us have to pay for the excesses of the wealthiest people amongst us. It's totally irresponsible and it's immoral.
Hey, Shaquille, speaking of wealthy people, and I want to hear what David's got to think about this as well. But there's a amazing individual who is an amazing individual in sports and everything, and everybody has been talking about the fact that he has made a horrible business decision and all along those lines. And then I was talking to some friends of mine and they were like, no, let me get this right. He came in at a certain amount of money that he bought this organization with, and he is selling it at almost 10 or 15 or 20 times what he originally came in at and all along those lines. How is that a horrible business decision? And yes, I'm talking about Michael Jordan, because Michael Jordan is about to sell the Charlotte Hornets and all in that space. But there's some folks out there that are going like, this has got to be one of the worst businesses of all times and everything. I'm like, well, let me get this right. You went in, and I don't know the exact figures, but let's just say $1 million. You went at it $1 million. You're selling at $100 million. You made $99 million. How is this a horrible business decision? And I don't get it, but there are people that are saying that he made as a horrible business owner and all in this space. But,
I find it fascinating that he's not getting criticised for the discounting capital gains tax that he gets to pay. Aren't you guys really worried about the rich not paying their fair share? But he's on your side of politics, so it's okay, I assume. Look, I won't comment about that particular business deal, but what I will say is it always boggles my imagination or my understanding of human beings in general to see them put their money into crypto or this stock or that, or whatever investment, because some celebrity told them to. Look, if you're a really good actor and you earn really good money, great. If you're a really good athlete and you earn really good money, great, good for you. That doesn't qualify you. Being a good basketball player doesn't qualify you to give investment advice. Being a really good actor doesn't qualify you to give advice about entering crypto.
No. Agreed, but I just want to know but the business deal seemed like a good one. Dave, what do you think? It was a good business deal.
First, let's come back and talk about the banking situation, which is what our primary topic is.
Yeah.
I question whether either one of these banks should have been categorized as too big to fail.
Yes.
All right. And if you there's a concentration risk with regard to Silicon Valley Bank, because as has been pointed out, they had a large number of startups and they had a large number of high-tech company investors, many of which were not startups and very successful companies, right? They had a very active political agenda, and they made lots of political contributions. And the governor of California is one of the persons who's going to benefit from this bailout because of his business interest using that bank. And so my question is that I don't know why we're doing what we're doing for these two banks, especially Standard. And secondly, I don't know what we're doing for whom and who's going to pay for it. All I know is that the President of the United States, backed up by the Treasury Secretary and the Fed and the FDIC chairman, has said nobody's going to lose money for these two banks, and the taxpayers aren't going to pay for it.
Well, how could they possibly not? How could the taxpayer possibly not pay for it? I mean, that's just this is la-la land from the president to be saying this.
Here, I'm speculating, Shaquille, because here's my key point. We don't know enough. There is a total lack of transparency with regard to this. All right.
Well, okay. So I know how they're going to do it. I got an idea how they're going to do it. They're going to print more money. And they print more money and cause a bigger problem with inflation and exacerbate the problem because it creates inflation is an indirect tax on the American people. Then wages are increased and that taxes people more. And we end up with hurting more of the poverty class, destroying the middle class.
Let me say something. Let me say something, Dave. You said we don't know enough about it because there's not enough transparency.
Right.
I actually would at this point, and call me a skeptic, but I would actually say we do know enough about it. We know that when central banks and when politicians intervene in the market, it is a very, very rare day indeed that the general population is better off because of it. So the fact of the matter is that they are interfering in the free market here. These were high-risk bets taken by a bank that specialized in high-risk bets, like you talked about with startups. We all know that tech was high risk, especially after the incredible uptick in the tech sector during 2020 and 2021. So we all knew this. We all were predicting that this was going to come to an end, that this dream run the tech sector had was going to have some problems. These guys over-leveraged themselves, and then they fell. Now, surely that's just a free market at work. But instead, the government has gotten together, the central bank has gotten together, and they've decided to bail this particular both of these banks out. This is interference in the free market. It never works out well. Name me an exception to the rule where it has worked out well when the government has intervened. So I don't think that the lack of transparency specifically on this is that big an issue. I think the issue is that we already know from countless examples in the past of where governments intervened that it's not going to work out well for the everyday person. At the end of the day, if the government gets it wrong, it's your problem because you have to pay for it.
No, I understand. Bad news flows downhill, and the downhill is the American people. But again, what we don't know enough about is the specifics with regard to these two institutions. What are they proposing to do in order to make sure that everybody gets their money? You may not have been on at first when I was the only one on with Kim. But what I said is that no single individual can unilaterally increase insurance limits for the FDIC. All right?
Yeah, I did hear you say that. Yeah.
They can't do that, right? So what are they going to do to make sure everybody gets paid? Are they going to have infusions of capital to deal with the liquidity problem? All right, so it's not an insurance issue. It's just a temporary liquidity issue. Are they going to have loans that are going to be made to try to deal with the temporary liquidity issue? How are they going to end up making sure that everybody gets their money when they can't unilaterally increase or eliminate, much less eliminate, the insurance limits? Okay.
Well, I can tell you what I can tell you what one of the proposals is, and I think that this is just the height of irresponsibility. I would, if I ran one of the funds that I used to be a manager of in this way, I'd go to jail. Right, the fact that they get to do it and they get complimented for it, it just blows my mind. What the proposal is at the moment is, because bond prices have fallen because of an increase in interest rates, the proposal is that they will be able to use those bonds, talk about other banks, not just these two, they'll be able to use those bonds at their full value, but not the face value, not its full face value. They'll be able to use the bonds at the price that they purchased them at, even if the open market price is less than that. And that's how they're going to bail them out. They're going to allow them to use that as collateral. That is absolutely absurd. And again, by doing that, you prevent small banks from starting up in, traditionally rural America. You have small banks, savings and loans. Why did that happen? Because they got squeezed by the big banks. This should not be happening. They should allow more competition into this area. And as I said, that's what their plan is. So they're going to find ways to get around the FDIC rules. They're going to find ways to get around the existing Treasury and Fed regulations in order to do this. It's not right.
Question to all of this. Why just pick a few banks to bail out? Why not, like Shaq is saying, why not invest more in the smaller banks rather than the bigger institutions? But why these two? And I have to agree with David. It's just a lack of transparency. There are a lot of questions in my brain every time I read about this that I'm asking why. And I mean, is there a way, David, to make them more transparent?
So before you answer that, David, hands up anybody who thinks that this is it. I mean, surely this is just the beginning. We're going to see a whole heap more distressed banks.
Oh, this is not the end.
No,
this is not the end, but this is just the start.
But we have to be careful not to try to cause a panic, which would cause depositors to go and do runs on banks, which would cause which would cause insolvencies in a number of institutions that otherwise might be able to weather it. Okay. I mean, so you have to walk a fine line here. Why these two banks? I'll tell you my opinion. Why these two banks? Politics.
Yep.
Politics.
No,
That's why these
Favors.
no,
Well, they are politically connected. They are politically active. Shaq, I don't know if you were on the phone, but before, but the CEO of Sovereign, of Silicon Valley Bank was on
Is on the board of the Fed. Yeah.
Barney Frank was on the board of Standard Bank of Dodd-Frank. Okay, both these banks were very politically active, if you will, and very well connected. The governor of California is going to benefit from this. All right, we have a systemic problem.
Democrats.
I don't know if you were on the call at the beginning when I said a lot of these things we've been talking about are interconnected. Too much federal spending, loose monetary policy leads to excess inflation, leads to higher interest rates. That combined with that results in lower values for fixed income securities. The Fed encouraged a lot of these banks to buy a lot of treasuries because we were having to borrow a lot of money. And that combined with increasing withdrawal requests leads to liquidity crisis. And what are you going to deal with it? And how much of it is temporary and how much of it is systemic? But for these two, I believe there's one reason they were picked, that they were selected: politics.
Dave,
Yep.
along
Dave,
the same
let me just respond to a couple of things that you said, and I just want to actually come back, if you don't mind, to what you said about we have to be careful about not alarming everybody to the point that it causes the bank run. Right now, I understand where you're coming from. However, if we look, you, as much as I respect you, I don't think you or I have the influence to cause a bank run. I'd like to think that we do. Maybe we could ask the banks to pay us not to cause one, but I don't think we quite have that influence. However, how can we justify, if we think that there is a systemic banking problem, how can we, or not just us, how could the Fed and all these people justify assuring everybody that the banks are safe if they're actually not? Let's go back a couple of years during COVID. Oh, everything's fine. It's not just a temporary pumping of money into the economy. We saw people listen to the government, listen to the Treasury, listen to the politicians, and go and buy second and third and fourth investment properties. And what's happened? Now the interest rates have gone up. They can't afford them. So, you try to stem the flow right now. You push the problem down a little bit further. And honestly, would you? Don't answer this. Would you personally want to have your money in one of those small banks? All you're going to do, most people, I think, are going to say, who is the biggest banks that I can put my money with because they're too big to fail? And once again, you crush competition for the big guys. This is just not a sustainable way of doing things. And frankly, with a bank run, I don't think what we're going to see with the majors is going to be as pronounced as what we've seen before, because what we know now is they have a certain amount of deposits. They're able to lend out 9 times as much. But of course, last time the banks were stressed, they took over the minimum reserve requirements. They just got rid of them, and you had unlimited amounts. So there's all sorts of ways that the banks. I mean, people talk about like Dan talks about the Fed. Or the Treasury creating all this money. Don't worry about what they're doing, Dan. Most money is created and destroyed by the commercial banks. So you take away their reserve requirements, bang, they can do whatever they want. And at the end of the day, the risk is not on them. The risk is on you, the taxpayer.
But
Right.
Dave, along those same lines, and this is a question to tie into what Shaquille just said, I think that one of the reasons that credit unions and savings and loans became very popular was because some of the big banks were not necessarily regulated in the way they should have been on some aspects of banking regulations. Because I am familiar, because I've got friends that are involved in that space as well, that predatory lending is a real thing. And a lot of times it's the big banks that are doing that and in that space. So I think that that's what created a lot of the savings and loans and credit unions. So I was wondering, am I onto something with that? And is that something that they need to be maybe better regulated?
Well, Mark, ask yourself two questions. One, why was there a saving and loans crisis in the first place? And who benefited from it? Answer those two questions. And I think that will tell you everything you need to know about both politics and the financial system.
I
let's
want
talk.
to point out one more thing that has just really been in the back of my brain and asking, but how much money, because I've kind of read a little bit here and there, did the banks actually receive that they never had to pay back from the COVID crisis? And the amount of money that they made on the fees for processing the PPP loans in general was in excess of $19 billion. So what kind of money did they receive? And should they really be having this problem? Because nobody had to pay back those loans. And I read somewhere that they received hundreds of billions of dollars of loans during COVID. So, I mean, why are they failing when they've received so much money, other than just bad with managing money, like David says?
Well,
because they put it all into high risk stuff. At the moment, if you think TARP was bad at 700 billion, they got 600 billion right now, top of book losses. Sorry, Dave.
Dave had a question.
Statement. Yeah. Let's talk about their balance sheets. Okay, I mean, clearly there's bad management, bad risk management.
Thank you.
Wasn't enough diversification, whatever. Let's talk about the balance sheet. I used to run an insurance company for the federal government. It's called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. I was in government when we had the savings and loan crisis. They tried to get me to take the FSLIC. I said no. So let's look at the balance sheets of banks. You're long on assets. Your assets are long. Your liabilities are short. In the case of a bank, their liabilities are their depositors. Okay, their checking accounts, the savings accounts, short-term CDs, whatever. Those are your liabilities. They're the asset to the other person, but they're the liabilities to you. Okay. So when you invest in long-term assets, you don't have as good a liquidity. And so if your depositors say, I want my money now, which is a liability for you, and if you have to end up liquidating some of your long-term assets in the face of rising interest rates, in the face of declining real estate prices, which that's the FSLIC, not now, okay, you got a big problem. You got a liquidity problem. Now, I was fortunate. I ran the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which, like every government corporation I've ever seen in my life, had a significant negative net worth. But the difference was we were the opposite of a bank, and we were the opposite of the FSLIC, because we had short-term assets which we can invest for longer-term duration, but we had long-term liabilities. Most of the liabilities we had were pension liabilities. They're going to have to be paid to people over several decades, and therefore we had much more of an ability to deal with the potential risk and imbalances associated with this. And so, I think we need to separate several things. We need to separate these two institutions, which I have a lot of questions about, and I think it's primarily politically motivated, from the systemic challenges and what needs to be done about those systemic challenges. And Shaq, I generally agree with you. When the government gets more involved, we're in trouble. And we also have to keep in mind there are several ways you can look at individuals. You can look at individuals as taxpayers. You can look at individuals as consumers. You can look at individuals as human beings. And no matter how you look at it, what they're proposing to do, the individual is going to get hit. Could be in the form of fees, could be in the form of tax, it could be different things, but ultimately bad news flows downhill, and the middle class and the lower income and the fixed income get disproportionately affected.
I think, Dave, one of the last shows I was on with you, I've been traveling for a bit, so I've been on for a while. Hope you missed me. I made fun of you and some of the other people on the panel for being boomers and how our generation is having to pay for all the things that happen in your generation. But the thing is that it's not just individuals today that are going to wear the brunt of what we're doing today. It's kids and grandkids that haven't even been born yet. And I think that there's an ultimate unfairness with that. The other thing that you talked about just then was in relation to long-term liabilities. And of course, you're right. What's the old saying where the guy went to the bank to make his withdrawal and he said, where's my money? And the bank manager said, well, there's $10,000 in John Smith's farm and there's, $15,000 over here and the other guy's house, and et cetera. I get what you're saying, but Have a look at what Lehman Brothers did. It wasn't just about the mortgage-backed securities and their derivatives trading around that. They had which honestly, I actually think that what they did was theoretically beautiful. They realized that they could enter the repo market and then repo those assets. So what do we have with the banks right now? They can use their loan book as an asset in a repo transaction. They don't have to only use government bonds to do it. So traditionally speaking, as you would well know, pension funds and insurance companies will often be the ones that provide the short-term liquidity to the banks based on the asset value of the...
Oop, we lost you.
He froze there and everything. Hey, Dave, quick question for you while I'm thinking about it and everything since Shaquille is frozen. And I heard him reference it earlier.
Sorry, I think I dropped off there. So meanwhile, you have the government regulations telling you how to value those sorts of assets. You've had the government saying for a couple of years, "Hey, look, go buy these assets. We want the market to go up. We want to try and support things during the COVID crisis." The roosters have to come home to roost at some point. And again, not to repeat myself, what's government going to do? Interfere more in something they've already interfered with? At some point, you've got to let something collapse. You've got to let somebody get hurt. And I think that the people should get hurt are the ones that are most able to do it, the ones that took the most amount of risk.
Shaq.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. That's what I was going to ask you, Dave. Because the question I was going to ask actually raises the question of those that had the most risk and everything. I've heard a couple of people, both on this show and other shows, talk about the tech bubble and everything. But then I hear educators, I hear entertainers, I hear other people saying that we're in this hybrid space, which means the tech should be surviving and everything. So has the tech bubble really burst, and is that who's going to bear the brunt of this next economic crisis, or is the tech bubble not really burst? Because, like I said, everybody that I know that's in
already burst
in entertainment talks about this hybrid model, which means tech has got to survive in that aspect.
Well,
my answer to you is who cares? Sorry, Dave, go.
I think tech is here to stay. I think I don't think we're facing another situation where you had the .com, which turned out to be the .bomb. I do think tech prices ended up benefiting disproportionately because of the impact of COVID. When you had so many people that wanted to stay home and were telecommuting and doing all these things, there has been some correction already in tech. You can't put it.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. We are closing the restaurant. That's why I need the restaurant bill to be signed.
But let me come back to something that Shaq said. Look, I think there's a failure of fiduciary responsibility in multiple dimensions, at least in the United States. Yeah, I want to come back to something that Shaq said, and that is a lot of the things that are going on here, the cost and consequences are not just going to be borne by those of us that are here today. They're going to be borne by future generations. And it's not just what government does, it's what government fails to do. And one example, they failed to discharge their fiduciary and stewardship responsibilities, not just to the current people, but to future generations. And I'm going to be testifying, I've just been notified, next week for the House Budget Committee to talk about a number of issues, including the failure of the Congress to discharge their fiduciary and stewardship responsibilities with regard to our nation's finances. And as I said before, I think a lot of these things are interrelated. It's not just what government does, it's what government fails to do because they are so short-term focused, tunnel vision, and self-interest. I want to get elected, I want to get reelected. And that's the number one priority.
I agree.
So Dave, when you give your testimony, you can jump in there and say, "Listen, I know this bloke called Shaquille from Australia, and he reckons you guys are out of control." And you won't have anybody that disagrees with you. I think it'll be great.
By the way, I really like your shirt, Shaq.
I do too.
I try.
Yeah, he's definitely in the tropical mode. But David, when are you testifying?
I haven't announced the date yet, but it's next week.
Okay.
They've got to notify the other side. Let me just say the other thing. Let's bring it down to the personal standpoint. Several months ago, I saw what was going on. And I did several things. One, I spread my cash among several different institutions to make sure that it's all fully insured.
Smart.
And I changed a lot of my investments, including investing more in participating annuity contracts, where I give up some of the upside, but I'm totally protected against the downside.
Right.
And I diversified on that front as well. And so, you know, I think one of the things that we have to do, since we're the ones talking about these issues and trying to figure out what's going on and what needs to be done, we need to lead by example and trying to do what we can in our own personal life to try to be able to hold these elected officials accountable to do the right thing, but also to try to protect ourselves and our families, from the adverse consequences of what they do and what they fail to do.
I agree.
I think as well, Dave. It's interesting what you've said there. I'm only a smidgen younger than you. So the participatory.
I didn't hear that.
I said I'm only a smidgen younger than you. Participatory annuities are a great investment, and I would certainly recommend them if I still had clients. I would certainly recommend them to clients that are, past 50, 60 years of age. I'd be suggesting that. To somebody who's in their 30s or 20s, I may not suggest that. I may suggest they take higher risk, and that's the thing that you normally sit down with a client and work out their individual situation, where they are in life, what they need to, what their goals are they still working, are they not working, etc. And unfortunately with government, what we often see is a top-down approach, a one-size-fits-all approach. And that is, in my view, that is one of the issues. Even coming back to what we were talking about with the banks, the risks being taken by something like the Silicon Valley Bank presumably versus someone like JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or whatever, they're going to be totally different risks. They're going to be exposed to different parts of the market. And so, you would be expecting there to be different results. In 2008, what did we see? We saw them give bailout money to every bank, even the banks that didn't need it, because they didn't want to identify which banks did need it. I mean, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense when we see the government come up with these types of things. Lastly, I just want to say to you, we talked about, although I was very critical of bailing out banks above the FDIC limit, but most insurance companies in the United States are insured by some sort of state government insurer or a state government run type thing.
Lower limits, by the way.
Yes, for a lower limit. However, I've only known of 3. I know there's a lot more than that, but just me personally, I'm aware of 3 insurance companies that failed. In all 3 cases, the state government's actually paid out the policyholders for the entire amount, even the amounts that are above the limit, because they wanted to make sure the insurance sector didn't have a hit to its reputation. So I do understand the argument for bailing out banks, but what I would say with insurance companies, don't regulate the hell out of it. Make sure that lots of different smaller insurance companies can exist, and then fiduciarily or prudentially manage them and regulate them. Do the same thing in the banking sector. I think you'd have a much more robust and competitive economy.
And here's what's shocking. There's a big debate going on right now that goes to the heart of this issue. There are people that are advocating for, we don't need community banks anymore.
Yeah.
All we need is 5 or 6 big banks with local branches. That's all we need. And some people point to, well, that's how a lot of the European nations have done it. That doesn't mean it's right. So I'd be interested in hearing, Shaq, your views, and Dan and Lee and others about that debate, about whether we should be going for fewer banks, or whether we should, let flowers bloom.
I'm a big supporter.
I am so against that.
Can I?
That's free enterprise.
Yeah, I'm a big supporter.
The integrity in allowing small banks to thrive. I'm so against it. It's so communist. What a communist attitude to let just
Can I respond to something that you said there, Dave? As much as I respect you, as you probably saw when the guy topped up, I'm having a glass of wine. Now, you may not like wine. You may think that wine companies shouldn't exist. Now, I'm sorry, but as much as I respect you, if I want to drink wine, that's up to me. So if you happen to think, Good. If you happen to think, and I'm not suggesting that you do, if you happen to think that we only need 5 or 6 banks, and I don't agree with you, and I and all my friends have gotten together and we want to start up our own community bank, who are you to tell me that I can't? And who are you to then go and lobby government and then have government tell me that I can't? This is the beauty of a free market, is that everybody gets what they want. If you want to bank with a big bank, go bank with a big bank. If you want to see a community bank, go start one up and bank with it. But you can't do that because of the interference of regulators and government, and that's the real shame. But that's the interference, and that's what causes the lack of competitiveness.
And Shaquille, let me restate, that's not my proproposal.
No, I know it's not. I know it's not. I was just using you as an example, Dave.
On this, I mean, that's a good question, David. Wow,
Lee, what's your thoughts? You're a presidential candidate.
I'm just against the whole bailout. It seems like we privatize the profits. And all these executives and the management, they make money in the good years. And then when it comes to losses, we nationalize the losses. And the taxpayer has to foot the bill for that. And it seems like there should be more skin in the game by those people running these companies. And they should be on the
hook. With that. So are you against the small institutional banks, or are you?
No, I agree with Shaq on that. People can start up and do whatever they want. Keep the regulations out of there and stop any things that are stopping people from going into business and doing what they want and parking their money where they want.
I agree. What about you, Dan? What is your thoughts on that question? That is a good question.
No, I think I'm all for stronger regional banks and the ability for communities to do economic development with their banking systems in local and regional areas and build up their communities through private investment and other things like that. I think centralizing the banks nationally and worldwide is a recipe for disaster. I think it plays right into the hands of those who want to control international banking system and control the wealth of the world. And we would be sacrificing our independence and freedom and liberty by letting those robber barons control our economic future. They want to do it badly. That's what the reset was all about. That's why they're putting so much pressure on it. I think this is what we're seeing as a result of it.
I think you're right too. I think it's a political move in order to try to drive that goal that they're talking about. Mark, what is your thoughts on that question? Wow.
I'm a big supporter of community banks. I've seen the benefits of community banks, and actually, to Shaquille's point, I did see an insurance company locally go under because it had a long track record and a long history, but they eventually wound up liquidating. That was North Carolina Mutual. But whether it's Guaranty State Bank, whether it's the Latin Credit Union, whether it's Mechanics and Farmers, and a number of other community-based banks, I have seen the importance of community-based banks. And actually, as many of you know, my mom, who is retired from all of her jobs, actually was on the board of what is considered one of the smaller banks, even though it is a smaller big bank. But she was actually on the board of BB&T, and that is actually in a lot of ways a community bank as well, even though it is not of the level of, say, a Bank America or a number of others. So definitely is something that
I would support a small local bank. We in Australia, we don't have very many small local banks. But I've got to tell you, I walk around America. Dave, you'll be pleased to know that for all of my comments, they actually let me into the United States just recently, and I do have an ESTA, so I can come back, and I'll be back there in about a month. So I'm allowed to enter. I've been allowed. Joe Biden didn't stop me.
That's because our computer systems are so bad, but that's okay.
Yeah, maybe. I entered from the northern border, not the southern border, so it's okay. But look, I've got to tell you, I walk around the country, and America is one of the few countries that I go to. It's the only country I go to where I can make what I think is an innocuous comment. Geez, I really love this country. What a great country. And I just get lectured to about how bad the place is by the people that are citizens that live there. I don't get it. But the thing is, I go around the country. I went to not as many states as usual. I went to Washington State, Oregon, California, very briefly to Charlotte, and then into New York. And I just find myself looking at how people view things and just going, what the? So if I could just use an example, the political left is generally the ones that are pretty progressive. They like crypto, they like decentralized finance. But then when it comes to actual money, actual banking, they advocate for massive centralization. what am I missing here? Why would you? How can you hold these two competing beliefs? You want DeFi on one side and then concentration of power on the other side? Is it
You're
me, or
assuming-
is there something in the drinking
No,
water that
no.
I've missed? What's happening?
You're
How long have you been running into?
assuming that they're logical. They're not.
Yeah, no. Liberals are not logical.
There are some logical liberals. Stop going there. And I don't know who you've been running into, because I know some folks that are very much into that community bank space that I would consider either liberal or moderate to liberal and everything in that space. But like I said, they are very much in that notion of loving it, like the self.
Mark, can I suggest to you that you tell those moderate to liberal friends of theirs that they better join the Republicans, because that seems to be the political right of your country's position on things at the moment.
Well, I'll
That's
check
the
with
only
the
thing
folks.
that's going to
I
bring
disagree.
things back.
Yeah, I disagree with it. Hey, Dave, I got a quick question. I know we're winding down.
For the record, two things. It sounds like we're all in agreement that you don't want to centralize into 5 or 6 banks, and there's a benefit. There's a benefit to having regional and community banks. I think we can all agree on that. I think we can also all agree that government, it has messed things up in many cases where they've done things that didn't make sense, and that they failed to do things that they should do, especially in circumstances where time is working against us, if you will. And so I think, this conversation is to be continued. I think we're coming to the end of our time pretty soon, but let me kick it back over to you, Kim, and see how you want to bring the ship into port.
Can I ask you a question that will have a very quick answer, Dave, to send us away? Let me ask you this. People from Milton Friedman to more recently Rand Paul, before him Ron Paul, have talked about, let's just get rid of the Fed, let the money supply be determined by the free market. Do you think that we could operate reasonably without not just the Fed in the United States, but without central banks in the world? Is that a viable option?
The answer is I definitely believe that we need Fed reform. I don't know how things would work without a Fed. I mean, one of the things that I've said before, Shaq, is the Fed's mission should be primarily maintaining stable prices, secondarily to promote macroeconomic growth. But beyond that, that's all it should do. And obviously bank oversight and supervision, which obviously they're not doing very well based on how things are going. They should not be in the unemployment business at all. They can't do anything about it. That's not their job. The problems in that area are ones that are caused, frankly, by the Congress.
I would ordinarily agree with
And we
you,
are at the top
but
of the
about
hour.
stable prices, that's interference. Yeah, shouldn't those prices of money be determined by the free market?
And I think that would be a good point to bring up next week. Please join us again next week on this wonderful conversation of the current economic affairs and what we can do as individuals to make it better. David M. Walker, thank you very much for this enlightening information. I look forward to hearing more about your journey to Washington, D.C. to be a witness for us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. Have a great day.
Unless he's testifying.